What would you do if everything you stood for was threatened by those who thrived on fear and intimidation? For Marcus, a Black War veteran, it wasn't just about defending his land. It was about showing an entire town that courage and unity could defeat even the most powerful enemies. Marcus Walker sat on the porch of his modest ranch house, the faint hum of cicadas blending with the rustling of the dry Texas wind. The sun was setting, casting a golden glow over the rolling hills that stretched beyond his land. Marcus, a decorated war hero, had traded the chaos of battlefields for the tranquility of this quiet border town. To the few who knew him well, he was a man of quiet strength, a mentor to local veterans, and a fixture of calm amidst a town simmering with unease. After years of service in the Army, where he earned countless accolades for bravery and leadership, Marcus sought solace in simplicity. His days were spent tending to his animals, fixing fences, and lending a hand at the local veterans center. Though his body bore the scars of war, a slight limp from a shrapnel wound, and a faded tattoo on his forearm commemorating his fallen brothers, his spirit remained unbroken. But Marcus's peaceful existence was often punctuated by the tensions that gripped the town. The once thriving community had grown wary as cartel activity spread across the region. Businesses paid protection fees, families lived in fear, and trust eroded with each passing day. The cartel's presence wasn't just a threat, it was a shadow looming over every aspect of life. Despite the unease, Marcus kept to himself, avoiding unnecessary conflict. He wasn't one to meddle in town affairs, but his silence wasn't born of fear. It was rooted in wisdom. Marcus had faced enemies far more dangerous than the cartel, but he knew that every battle required patience, strategy, and timing. The cartel's grip on the town tightened with each passing month, marked by their flashy cars, tattoos, and ostentatious displays of power. They moved with a swagger that dared anyone to oppose them. To most residents, the cartel was untouchable, a force too powerful to resist. Among the cartel's ranks was Hector Ruiz, their ruthless leader. Hector wasn't just feared for his violent methods, he thrived on intimidation and control. His men ruled the streets, collecting money from businesses and silencing dissent with brutal efficiency. When Hector's men noticed Marcus at the local market one day, his quiet demeanor caught their attention. To them, Marcus's reserved nature and solitary lifestyle were signs of weakness. They didn't know his history, nor did they care to learn. Their assumptions were fueled by prejudice. Marcus, a black man in a predominantly white and Hispanic community, often faced the subtle stings of racism. Some saw him as an outsider, despite his years of service and the sacrifices he had made for his country. For the cartel, Marcus's race made him an easy target. Hector's men began asking questions about Marcus, who he was, why he had so much land, and whether he could be coerced into selling it. The ranch's strategic location near a key smuggling route made it valuable, and Hector was determined to claim it. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Marcus leaned back in his chair, his sharp eyes scanning the fields. He had a sense that trouble was brewing, but his expression remained calm. Years of experience had taught him that storms, whether on the battlefield or in life, were inevitable. What mattered was how you faced them. The peaceful rhythm of Marcus's life was shattered one late afternoon, when the sound of roaring engines echoed down the dirt road leading to his ranch. A convoy of black SUVs kicked up clouds of dust as they approached, coming to a halt just outside his front gate. Marcus, seated on his porch with a glass of iced tea, watched the scene unfold with a calm yet vigilant demeanor. He placed the glass down and stood, his well-worn boots crunching against the gravel as he approached the gate. 3 men stepped out of the lead vehicle, their swagger and flashy attire marking them as members of Hector Ruiz's cartel. Their leader, a young man with a cocky grin and dark sunglasses, leaned against the hood of the car, sizing Marcus up like a predator eyeing prey. "You the one who owns all this land?" the man asked, gesturing lazily toward the fields behind Marcus. "I am," Marcus replied, his voice steady and calm. "We've got an offer for you," the man continued, smirking. "Sell it to us. We'll pay good money. More than this place is worth. Marcus crossed his arms, his expression unreadable. Not interested. The man's smirk faltered, replaced by a sneer. You sure about that? Be a shame if something happened to this nice little ranch of yours. It was a thinly veiled threat, but Marcus didn't flinch. This land's not for sale, he said firmly, and I don't take kindly to threats. The cartel members exchanged amused glances before turning. Back to Marcus. We'll see about that, the leader said, his voice dripping with arrogance. You'll change your mind soon enough. The men returned to their vehicles, their departure as loud and brash as their arrival. Marcus stood at the gate long after the dust settled, his mind already calculating his next move. It didn't take long for the threats to escalate. A few nights later, Marcus was awakened by the sound of breaking glass. He rushed outside to find his barn ablaze, the flames licking at the sky as smoke billowed into the night. The horses inside whinnied in panic, and Marcus didn't hesitate. He grabbed a blanket, soaked it in water, and ran into the barn to free the animals. His swift action saved them, but the barn was a total loss. The next morning, Marcus found graffiti sprayed across the side of his house. The words were crude and racist, a blatant attempt to intimidate him. He cleaned it off without a word, his face a mask of calm determination. The town began to notice the tension brewing between Marcus and the cartel. Some neighbors whispered words of support, but most kept their distance, too afraid to get involved. The prejudice that had always simmered below the surface in the town began to rise. Some even blamed Marcus for drawing the cartel's attention, their biases clouding their judgment. Despite the mounting threats, Marcus refused to back down. He began preparing for the inevitable confrontation, his military training kicking in. He reinforced his property, installing motion sensor lights and cameras. He mapped out the land, identifying key vantage points and potential traps. But Marcus's preparations weren't just physical. He also reached out to old military contacts, alerting them to the situation. Though he didn't want to involve law enforcement yet, he knew it was important to have allies if things escalated further. Late one evening, as Marcus worked on repairing his fence, a young boy from the town rode up on his bike. "Mr. Walker," the boy said nervously, glancing around, "my dad told me to tell you they're coming back tonight." Marcus nodded, his calm exterior never wavering. "Thank you," he said. "You head home now and don't worry about me." As the boy pedaled away, Marcus stood alone in the fading light, his silhouette framed by the vast expanse of his land. He knew the cartel would return, and he was ready. The night air was heavy with tension as Marcus stood on his porch, his keen eyes scanning the shadows that stretched across his ranch. The silence of the evening was deceptive, masking the storm that was about to descend. Around him, the land lay still, but Marcus had prepared for this moment. Every inch of his property was now fortified with traps and deterrents, subtle yet effective measures born from years of military strategy. The growl of engines shattered the quiet, the sound unmistakable as a convoy of SUVs approached. The vehicles screeched to a halt just outside his gate, their headlights illuminating the front yard in a harsh glare. Doors slammed, and a group of armed men spilled out, their movements deliberate and threatening. At the center of the group stood Hector Ruiz, his sharp features twisted in a smug grin. He was here to make an example of Marcus, to remind the town who held the power. "Mr. Walker," Hector called out, his voice laced with mock politeness. "You've been causing us a lot of trouble. Tonight, we settle this." Marcus stepped off the porch, his steady gait belying the simmering resolve within him. He carried no weapon, only the confidence of a man who had faced far worse adversaries. "You've made a mistake coming here, Hector," Marcus said, his tone calm but firm. The cartel leader chuckled, spreading his arms theatrically. "A mistake? No, my friend. The mistake was yours, thinking you could defy me." Without warning, Hector gestured to his men, and they surged forward. But as soon as their boots crossed the gate, Chaos erupted. Hidden tripwires triggered flashbangs, disorienting the intruders with blinding light and deafening noise. Panic spread through their ranks as they stumbled, their bravado crumbling in the face of Marcus's calculated defenses. Marcus moved with precision, using the chaos to his advantage. He darted between shadows, his movements swift and deliberate. In seconds, he disarmed two men, their weapons clattering uselessly to the ground. The others, still reeling from the traps, hesitated, their fear palpable. Hector, infuriated by the turn of events, shouted orders, trying to regain control. But Marcus had anticipated every move. With a swift maneuver, he cornered Hector, his imposing figure casting a shadow over the cartel leader. "It's over," Marcus said, his voice steady and unyielding. "You've already lost." Hector sneered, but the fear in his eyes betrayed him. "You think you're untouchable?" he spat. Marcus leaned in, his gaze unwavering. "I'm not untouchable, but I am unshakable. And you've underestimated the wrong man." The sound of sirens in the distance broke the standoff. Marcus's earlier call to his contacts had paid off. Law enforcement was closing in. As the cartel members scrambled to flee, they found themselves surrounded. Hector's arrogance evaporated as officers stormed the property, arresting him and his men. As Hector was led away in cuffs, he cast one last glance at Marcus. The war hero stood tall, his presence a stark reminder that resilience and integrity could dismantle even the most powerful threats. For Marcus, the confrontation wasn't just a victory, it was a statement. On that night, he proved that courage, combined with preparation, could silence even the loudest forces of intimidation. As the last of the cartel's vehicles disappeared into the night, Marcus stood alone on his porch, the adrenaline slowly leaving his system. The flashing lights of law enforcement had faded, and the stillness of his ranch returned. Yet, in the quiet, memories from his past began to resurface, moments that had shaped the man who stood here today, unyielding in the face of adversity. Years earlier, Marcus had been a young recruit in the U.S. Army, eager to serve his country, but quickly faced with challenges beyond the battlefield. As a black soldier, he had endured subtle and overt racism, even among his comrades. But Marcus's resolve only deepened with each obstacle. He pushed himself harder, mastering every skill and rising through the ranks with quiet determination. One memory stood out vividly, a harrowing mission in the unforgiving terrain of Afghanistan. His unit had been ambushed during a supply drop, their convoy pinned down by relentless enemy fire. Amid the chaos, Marcus had taken command, his calm demeanor rallying his team. He devised a strategy to outmaneuver the enemy, saving his unit from what seemed like certain defeat. That day, he earned not only a medal for valor, but also the respect of those who had doubted him. But the battlefield wasn't the only place Marcus fought for recognition. Returning home after his service, he faced a new struggle, the prejudice that clung to civilian life. Job interviews where his qualifications were overlooked, neighborhoods where his presence was questioned, and countless microaggressions reminded him that his fight wasn't over. Still, Marcus refused to let bitterness define him. He channeled his experiences into action, mentoring young veterans and speaking at schools about resilience and unity. His quiet leadership inspired many, but Marcus never sought the spotlight. He believed true strength was measured not by accolades, but by the ability to endure and uplift others. Back at the ranch, Marcus ran his fingers over an old medal displayed on a shelf, the bronze surface catching the moonlight. It wasn't just a symbol of his bravery, it was a reminder of the sacrifices he had made and the lessons he had learned. The discipline, strategy, and resilience he honed in the military had prepared him for moments like tonight. The confrontation with the cartel wasn't just about defending his land, it was about standing up against a lifetime of being underestimated. Hector Ruiz and his men had seen Marcus as an easy target, a man they believed would cower in the face of their power. They hadn't realized they were facing a war hero, a man who had stared down far greater threats and emerged unbroken. As the first rays of dawn crept over the horizon, Marcus took a deep breath, the cool morning air filling his lungs. He felt a sense of peace, knowing that he had stood his ground not just for himself, but for the principles he had fought for his entire life. And while the memories of his past lingered, they didn't weigh him down. They fueled his purpose. The calm didn't last long. Marcus had won the first round, but Hector Ruiz wasn't the kind of man to let a challenge go unanswered. Days after the confrontation, Marcus's ranch became eerily quiet, as if nature itself anticipated what was coming. Hector, humiliated by his loss and the arrest of several of his men, vowed to make an example of Marcus. In the cartel's world, power was everything. Hector's reputation had been tarnished, and to restore it, he needed to retaliate. The plan was brutal, a full-scale ambush that would send a clear message to anyone who dared stand in their way. One evening, as Marcus sat on his porch watching the sunset, the distant rumble of engines signaled their return. This time, it wasn't just a few men. Hector had brought an army. Trucks and SUVs bristling with armed men rolled down the dusty road toward the ranch. The headlights cast long, menacing shadows, and the air buzzed with the tension of what was to come. Marcus stood, his calm demeanor masking the calculated readiness within him. He had expected Hector to retaliate and had spent the past few days preparing. Every trap, every vantage point, every contingency was in place. He didn't want a fight, but he wasn't about to back down either. The vehicle stopped at the edge of his property, and Hector emerged, flanked by his men. He wore a confident sneer, but his eyes burned with anger. "You think you're untouchable, Walker?" Hector called out, his voice echoing across the open land. "You embarrassed me. You humiliated my men. Now you'll pay the price." Marcus stepped forward, his silhouette framed by the fading light. "You had your chance to leave peacefully," he said, his voice steady. "What happens next is on you." Hector laughed, a harsh, mocking sound. "Big words for a man alone," he spat, gesturing for his men to advance. As they crossed the boundary of Marcus's land, the first trap was triggered. A series of tripwires set off loud flashbangs, disorienting the advancing men. Some dropped their weapons in confusion, while others scrambled for cover. Marcus used the chaos to his advantage, moving swiftly and silently through the shadows. From a concealed position, Marcus began disabling the intruders one by one. Using his military training, he incapacitated them with precision, avoiding lethal force but ensuring they couldn't continue. He relied on his knowledge of the terrain, leading the cartel members into traps and bottlenecks that left them vulnerable. Hector, still standing near the vehicles, watched in frustration as his men fell apart. His confidence wavered, and he shouted orders, trying to regain control. But Marcus was everywhere and nowhere, his presence a ghostly force that dismantled the attack with methodical precision. Finally, Marcus emerged from the shadows, stepping into the open with calm authority. He faced Hector directly, his piercing gaze locking onto the cartel leader. "It's over, Hector," Marcus said, his voice cutting through the chaos. Hector, now visibly shaken, raised a pistol, his hand trembling. "You think you've won?" he snarled, trying to mask his fear. Marcus didn't flinch. "This isn't winning," he replied. "This is justice, and you've already lost." Before Hector could react, the sound of sirens pierced the night air. Marcus's earlier call to federal agents had borne fruit, and law enforcement vehicles flooded the road, their lights flashing. Officers swarmed the scene, arresting the remaining cartel members and securing the area. Hector was cornered, his bravado replaced by desperation. As he was cuffed and led away, he glared at Marcus. "You'll regret this," he hissed. Marcus stepped closer, his calm demeanor unshaken. "The only thing I regret," he said, "is that it took this long for you to face the consequences of your actions." As the cartel's vehicles were towed away and the remaining men rounded up, the once threatening presence dissolved into silence. The night returned to its quiet state, with only the faint hum of cicadas in the background. Marcus watched as the last patrol car disappeared down the road, his land now safe. For the first time in days, he allowed himself to exhale. This wasn't just a victory for him. It was a stand against injustice, a reminder that courage and preparation could triumph over even the most powerful enemies. The morning after the raid, the quiet town of Redstone buzzed with activity. News of Marcus's standoff with the cartel had spread like wildfire, reaching every corner of the community. At first, the townspeople had been hesitant to speak up about the cartel's control, fearing retaliation. But Marcus's courage inspired a ripple effect, breaking the silence that had paralyzed them for so long. At the local diner, a small crowd gathered to discuss the events of the previous night. "Did you hear what Walker did?" an elderly man asked, his voice filled with awe. "Took on Hector Ruiz and his whole crew. The man's a hero." The sentiment was echoed throughout the town. Marcus, who had always kept to himself, suddenly found himself the subject of admiration and respect. The townsfolk, many of whom had turned a blind eye to the cartel's presence, began to rally together, emboldened by Marcus's stand. The sheriff, who had long struggled to gather evidence against the cartel, was among the first to approach Marcus. Standing on the porch of the ranch, his hat in hand, the sheriff said, "You've done more to clean up this town in one night than I could in years. I owe you." Marcus, ever humble, shook his head. "You don't owe me anything. But this isn't just my fight. It's everyone's. The cartel thrives on fear. The only way to beat them is by standing together." The sheriff nodded, his resolve strengthened. He began organizing meetings with local business owners and residents, encouraging them to provide evidence against the cartel. With the community united, the floodgates opened. Shopkeepers who had been paying protection fees came forward, as did families who had been threatened into silence. One evening, a group of townspeople arrived at Marcus's ranch, armed not with weapons, but with tools and supplies. They had come to repair the damage done by the cartel, fixing fences, rebuilding the barn, and repainting the graffiti-stained walls. "We can't let you do this alone," said Maria, the owner of the local grocery store. "You stood up for us. Now it's our turn to stand with you." For Marcus, it was a humbling sight. People who had once been divided by fear and prejudice were now united, working together to reclaim their town. The act of rebuilding wasn't just about fixing physical damage. It was a symbolic gesture of resilience and renewal. As the days passed, the transformation extended beyond the ranch. Local businesses flourished without the burden of extortion. Schools and community centers, once neglected, became vibrant hubs of activity. The town began to thrive in a way it hadn't for years. Despite his newfound status as a local hero, Marcus remained grounded. When a reporter from a nearby city arrived to interview him, Marcus deflected the attention. "This isn't about me," he said. "It's about what happens when people come together. Change doesn't start with one person. It starts with a community." The reporter's article highlighted not just Marcus's bravery, but the collective efforts of the town. The story gained national attention, painting Redstone as a model of resilience and unity. For Marcus, the greatest reward wasn't the recognition. It was the sight of his neighbors walking the streets with their heads held high, no longer afraid. He saw it in the children playing freely, the shopkeepers greeting customers with smiles, and the farmers working their fields without looking over their shoulders. Redstone was no longer a town gripped by fear. It was a town reclaimed by its people. The morning light spilled over Marcus's ranch, illuminating a scene that had changed overnight. Where fear had once gripped the town, a new energy was palpable, a mix of relief, gratitude, and unity. Marcus, as usual, was up early, tending to his animals and repairing the damage left by the cartel's attack. But this time, he wasn't alone. A steady stream of neighbors arrived at his property, armed with tools, paint, and determination. "We owe you, Marcus," Maria, the grocery store owner, said as she handed him a new fence post. "It's about time we did something right." What began as a few volunteers quickly grew into a full-scale community effort. Families brought food, kids pitched in to clean up debris, and the local hardware store donated supplies. The people of Redstone, once divided by fear and indifference, were now working side by side to rebuild what had been damaged. For Marcus, it was a humbling sight. He had never sought recognition or repayment, but seeing the town come together filled him with quiet pride. Word of Marcus's bravery spread quickly. At the diner that morning, his name was on everyone's lips. The sheriff, who had struggled for years to combat the cartel's grip, made a public statement. "Marcus Walker is a hero," he said to the gathered crowd. "He's shown us that fear doesn't have to define us. We've got to take back our town, not just for ourselves, but for the next generation." The sheriff's words struck a chord. For the first time, local business owners who had quietly endured the cartel's extortion began coming forward with information. Farmers, shopkeepers, and families shared their stories of intimidation and abuse, giving law enforcement the evidence they needed to pursue justice. The cartel, once untouchable, was finally being held accountable. At the same time, the community began to transform in ways no one had anticipated. Without the shadow of fear, local businesses thrived. Families who had considered leaving Redstone decided to stay, reinvesting in the town's future. Schools and community centers, once neglected, became vibrant hubs of activity. Marcus's ranch became a symbol of resilience, visited not just by neighbors, but by people from nearby towns who wanted to thank him for what he had done. Despite the newfound attention, Marcus remained as grounded as ever. When a journalist arrived from a nearby city to interview him, Marcus deflected the spotlight. "This isn't about me," he said simply, his voice steady. "This is about what happens when people stand together. Fear only has power if we let it." The journalist's article, detailing Marcus's stand against the cartel and the town's transformation, went viral, capturing national attention. But for Marcus, the greatest reward wasn't the headlines or the admiration. It was seeing Redstone's streets filled with children playing, shopkeepers greeting customers with smiles, and neighbors looking out for one another. The town had reclaimed its soul, and Marcus knew that this sense of unity was the real victory. That evening, as Marcus sat on his porch, watching the sunset with his dog lying at his feet, a young boy rode up on a bicycle. "Mr. Walker," the boy said, his face glowing with excitement, "my dad says he's proud of you." "We all are." Marcus smiled, tipping his hat. "Tell your dad I'm proud of him too," he replied. As the boy rode off, Marcus leaned back in his chair, a deep sense of peace settling over him. For the first time in a long while, Redstone felt like home again. Hector Ruiz sat in the dimly lit cell, his once imposing demeanor replaced by a brooding silence. Gone were the tailored suits, the gold chains, and the entourage that had trailed him like shadows. In their place was the reality of his fall: a cold steel bed, a cracked mirror, and the unrelenting hum of fluorescent lights. Hector had built his empire on fear, intimidation, and violence. But now, stripped of his power, he was just another prisoner waiting for his day in court. The legal case against Hector was staggering. With the cartel's arrest during the standoff at Marcus's ranch, law enforcement had gained access to records, accounts, and testimonies that painted a damning picture. Local business owners came forward, emboldened by Marcus's courage, sharing details of the extortion schemes that had drained their livelihoods. Families who had suffered in silence spoke out, their stories exposing the cartel's brutal tactics. The evidence was overwhelming, and Hector's reputation was reduced to ashes. As the trial began, Hector maintained his arrogance, brushing off the accusations as exaggerations. But his confidence began to waver when witnesses took the stand. Maria, the grocery store owner, described years of harassment and threats. The sheriff presented detailed accounts of illegal operations that tied directly back to Hector. And then there was Marcus, who testified with a calm authority that silenced the courtroom. When Marcus spoke, it wasn't with vengeance or malice. Instead, his words carried a profound sense of justice. Hector Ruiz thrived on fear, on convincing people they were powerless, he said. But power doesn't come from violence or intimidation. Real power comes from standing together, from refusing to let fear dictate your life. Hector shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his bravado cracking under the weight of Marcus's testimony. For the first time, he looked less like a leader and more like a man cornered by his own actions. The jury's decision was swift. Hector was found guilty on multiple counts, including extortion, racketeering, and conspiracy. The sentence was harsh but just: life in prison without parole. The courtroom erupted in quiet murmurs, a collective sense of relief washing over those who had come to witness the end of Hector's reign. As Hector was led away in handcuffs, he glanced toward Marcus, his expression a mixture of anger and resignation. Marcus met his gaze, his calm and steady demeanor unchanged. For the people of Redstone, Hector's conviction marked the end of an era of fear. But for Marcus, it was something deeper, a reaffirmation of the principles he had lived by. Justice wasn't about revenge. It was about accountability, about ensuring that those who harmed others could no longer do so. That evening, as Marcus returned to his ranch, he felt the weight of the past weeks begin to lift. Hector was gone. The town was united, and a sense of hope had taken root. Sitting on his porch, Marcus looked out over his land, the stars above shining brighter than they had in years. Redstone was no longer a town haunted by fear. It was a place where courage and resilience had triumphed. The quiet of the evening wrapped itself around Marcus's ranch as he stood near the edge of his land, gazing at the horizon where the golden hues of the setting sun blended into the purple sky. The past few weeks had been a whirlwind of tension, bravery, and ultimately triumph. But tonight, there was peace. Marcus reflected on the journey that had brought him here, the threats from Hector Ruiz, the damage to his land, and the fear that once gripped the town now felt like distant memories, though their lessons were fresh in his mind. He thought of how quickly the community had rallied together when given the opportunity. People who once walked with their heads down in quiet submission had found their voices, and neighbors who barely exchanged greetings were now standing shoulder to shoulder to rebuild what had been broken. "It wasn't just me," Marcus murmured to himself, the weight of his words grounding him. The courage he displayed had been the spark, but the true victory belonged to the town, the farmers, shopkeepers, and families who dared to believe that things could change. The sheriff, who had once felt powerless, was now leading efforts to ensure the cartel's influence never returned. Maria's grocery store, once a symbol of oppression, was thriving, and children now roamed the streets freely without fear. The transformation of Redstone was palpable. The town had become a symbol of resilience, a place where people stood against hate and injustice. Community meetings became regular events, addressing issues like inclusion and safety. Marcus himself was invited to speak at several gatherings, where he emphasized the importance of unity and courage. "This isn't about one man," he said during one such meeting, his deep, steady voice carrying through the room. "It's about what we can achieve when we refuse to let fear control us. Together, we're stronger than anything that tries to divide us." His words resonated beyond the boundaries of the small town as Marcus's story began to inspire others. Reports of his stand against the cartel were shared widely, prompting other communities to address the challenges they faced with newfound determination. Marcus received letters from veterans, young activists, and even strangers who had read about his bravery. Despite the attention, Marcus remained humble. He spent his days tending to his land, repairing what was lost, and enjoying the calm he had worked so hard to preserve. The nights were his favorite, sitting on the porch with a cup of tea, his dog resting at his feet, and the quiet hum of nature surrounding him. As the last light of the sun dipped below the horizon, Marcus leaned back in his chair, a quiet smile playing on his lips. He felt a deep sense of fulfillment, not because he had defeated a cartel or become a local hero, but because he had helped remind his town of their strength. For the first time in years, Redstone felt like a home he could truly belong to. The stars began to emerge, dotting the sky with their gentle glow as Marcus closed his eyes and breathed in the cool night air. The battle had been won, but the real victory was the unity, courage, and peace that now defined the place he called home.